Today, we're going to break down a really fascinating and honestly kind of mind-bending framework for looking at the world. It comes from an observer named Varun Raju, who has this idea he calls the 1% reality. So let's jump right in and see what it's all about.
Everything, and I mean everything, kicks off with this one simple number, 1%. So what does it mean? Well, according to this idea, that tiny number is the key to understanding the huge gap between what you actually personally experience and everything else you're just told is happening.
And there it is. The 1% reality is just what is happening directly in front of you, right now. It's the only slice of the world you could truly verify with your own senses, with no one else in between. You know, the room you're in, the device you're watching this on, that's your 1%. But okay, if that's only 1%, what in the world makes up the other 99?
So this is how the whole picture is laid out. Our 1% of direct, see it with your own eyes reality is just that tiny, tiny sliver. Then you have this massive 50% chunk, which the author calls the mediated world. And the rest, that other 49%, is labeled unverified stories. Let's tackle that biggest piece first, the 50%er.
So, according to this model, fully half of what we think of as reality comes straight from the media. It's our window to people, places, and events that we'll probably never ever see for ourselves. It pretty much shapes our entire understanding of the planet.
Yeah, this 50% is basically everything happening everywhere else on Earth. And it's all right there for us, if we choose to look. It's the news on TV, it's the feeds you scroll through on your phone, it's a version of the world packaged and delivered right to us.
Okay, so that raises a pretty big question, right? We've got our 1% accounted for, and the media is 50%. We're at 51%. What on earth is going on in that other, almost equally huge 49% chunk? And this is where things get really interesting.
This last piece, this other 49%, is described as a realm that is basically defined by one thing and one thing only: total disagreement. It's the space where everyone seems to have a different story.
The author puts it bluntly, calling this part fake conspiracy stories. But the key takeaway here isn't necessarily whether the stories are true or false. The defining feature is that there's just no common point of agreement. It's a chaotic world of competing narratives where nobody can agree on the basic facts.
So you can see the problem this creates, right? If only 1% of our reality is something we can actually touch and see, how are we supposed to navigate the other 99%? How do we decide what's real? To really hammer this point home, the author uses this brilliant analogy. Okay, to make this whole abstract idea feel a bit more real, let's look at this powerful analogy: a rocket launch to Mars. We're asked to think about this not just as a cool science thing, but as a big exercise in public belief and what actually counts as proof. The setup is super simple. Imagine a totally credible, authenticated company. They've got the scientists, the paperwork, the math, the whole shebang. And they're all set to launch a rocket to Mars. Everything looks completely above board. Now, the mission has three main parts. First, you've got the launch. We can all watch that part. Then there's the long, long journey through space. And finally, you have the landing or the splashdown, which we can also see on a screen. The beginning and the end seem pretty straightforward.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The author splits these events into two totally different buckets. The launch and the landing, those are called true, verifiable scenes. But the journey itself, the months and months of flying through deep space, that part is described as being totally digital. For us, it only exists as computer animations and data on a screen.
And all of this leads to a pretty shocking claim. Despite seeing it take off and seeing it land, the author states, and I'm quoting here, "Nobody knows whether the rocket launched on the Mars." So why? Why would they say that? Well, because that critical middle part was never actually seen by any of us.
The argument basically boils down to this. For something to be truly proven, everyone would need to be able to visualize that rocket physically. And since that's, an impossible task for something like a Mars mission, that means universal first-hand proof just isn't possible.
So where does all this lead? It actually takes us to a really profound final thought about what knowledge and history and all the records we keep even mean.
And here it is, the ultimate conclusion. Until that impossible day comes when we can all physically witness something together, all the records are only for the sake of records. They exist as claims, as stories, as data points, but not as a shared, verifiable reality in the same way as your personal 1%.
And that right there leaves us with this huge, challenging question. This framework basically suggests that most of what we call reality, from big historical events to major scientific breakthroughs, falls into that 99% of mediated or disputed stuff. So if we can't all watch it happen with our own two eyes, what does it actually take for us to believe a record is real? It's a question that kind of shakes the very foundation of how we agree on what's true.